Hello and welcome to Walkative, San Francisco. We're broadcasting from San Francisco today. We have a very special guest who's going to be introduced by Dolly Kershaw, who is today our guest host. We've been running a couple of Walkatives over the last few weeks to complement the RCA 2020 platform. And Dolly has her work available for viewing on the 2020 RCA platform. The link is in the chat box. And also, so does Katharina Siegel, who is one of the Walkative presidents and has been organizing events over the year. She's here with us as one of our panelists. And of course, Simon King, who is co-founder of Walkative and will be keeping a close eye on the chat box. So if you have any questions as we start our walk, please just feel free to put a question in the chat and we'll raise it along the way. We want to keep something of the atmosphere of and the feel of a walk. So it's important that we break it up with questions as we go. So please feel free to ask any questions as we're walking. Just to remind you that we have previous walks recorded on YouTube. So if you are interested, you can view all of the walks that have taken place under this kind of general heading of walking cities in lockdown. Okay, so probably enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Dolly, who will introduce today's guest walker or lead walker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaspar. Hi everyone, I'm Dolly. I've just completed the MA Sculpture RCA. As part of the MA, I was very lucky to go to Texas from like August to December of 2019. So I did a whole semester there and I had such an amazing time. I made a lot of friends, made a lot of work. And one of those friends was Ania here, who is Ukrainian born, living in the US for quite some time. And she's living between Austin and San Francisco. And I thought she'd be great to talk because, I mean, narration is actually part of her practice. She's a video artist using narration as well. And yeah, she's just a great friend. I thought she'd really have something really interesting to say about the city. So at the moment, she's actually working from all the research she's been doing on San Francisco. She's actually thinking about, she's working on a new video work about San Francisco. So this has been a great opportunity for her as well, I think, in that way as well. She's just finished a new video piece, which is on her website, which I'm going to paste in a minute. It's called Westward Ho, and it's about kind of hidden species and cryptids, which includes things like yetis and the Loch Ness and stuff like this. But she's yeah, you have to look at the short film on her website to see this. And she's also working on a piece of I think this is correct, like a speculative documentary, which is set in the future, imagining that all of our left-wing ideals will come into fruition. And in the film, she's she's interviewing experts and in politics who kind of answer, you know, as if this future has really happened or is happening, and talking about the successes and the failures. So I'm really excited to see that. I think it's very key at the moment to think about this. So yeah, thank you so much, Ania, for joining us. And I'll let you go ahead with your talk. Thank you.
Dolly, thank you so much for the introduction. Jaspar, Simon, Dolly, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And it's been a pleasure, and I'll just start. I'll begin sharing my screen. Making sure that you can see what's going on. Can you? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know why I love San Francisco so much, but I really do. I was born in Ukraine, and in the past decade, I lived in Moscow, Warsaw. I moved to Sydney, lived in Jakarta for some time, and then in Texas and South Florida. But I have never felt home anywhere until I moved here. And I was so excited to do this talk, in part to understand my love and curiosity for the city and hopefully share it with you. And San Francisco is certainly set in one of the most spectacular natural locations on the planet. But if you look at it from the perspective of early settlers, you realize that it's an isolated peninsula surrounded by water from 3 directions. It's foggy, gray, windy. It had no trees 250 years ago. Take away its 2 bridges and it's virtually an island. And incidentally, that's what the Spanish thought when they landed here in 1776. They described it as the very worst place to settle in California because it had nothing but sand dunes and coyote brush. And just like water and earthquakes shape the topography of this peninsula, cultural waves left the traces that are almost as distinct as San Francisco hills and valleys. And World War II naval shipyards, Summer of Love, Beats era in North Beach, the fight for gay rights in the 70s, all these were also waves of immigration. And they created very distinct neighborhoods that started as isolated cultural islands, but eventually they got embedded into basically the fabric of the city. And people living in them came here often to reinvent themselves and to start living absolutely anew. And they learned to coexist with each other. And out of many relatively conservative cultures, one of the most tolerant places on earth, definitely in the United States, was born. And the path there has, some glorious and some shameful moments. 250 years ago, there was very little here that would make a good place to found the city. And it was an undesirable spit of land too far west. And now it's living proof that we can make and remake the world. So before San Francisco became San Francisco, there was Yerba Buena, a small settlement of tallow traders. And before Yerba Buena, there was Mission and Presidio. And you're looking at the Mission Dolores building, one of the earliest buildings that's survived from that era. And this is Presidio. So Spanish pattern of colonization relied on building missions to convert Native Americans. This is a drawing of Yelamu people who lived here pre-contact. So yeah, the Spanish pattern of colonization relied on missions to convert people, Native Americans, and Presidios, military posts, were there for the cases they were found uncooperative. And Yelamu people who Spanish encountered, and what you're looking at is the park overlooking Mission Dolores, and that tower in the background is a part of the Mission San Francisco Diocese and its whole complex. So Yelamu who lived here were hunters and gatherers. And what Spanish tried to do is they tried to corral them into what essentially was medieval monastic life. And ironically, even in Europe in the height of Middle Ages, only 1% of population found this way of life acceptable. And one of the few signs that Yelamu and Ohlone, a larger tribal group that they belonged to, flourished here for so many thousands of years is the oldest cemetery in San Francisco that is in the background, and likely some of the unmarked burial sites are in this park. There are 5,000 unmarked graves in here, and all these people died from crude conversion attempts that were very little removed from slavery. And so sorry, this is, I'm gonna skip this as it's another video of the mission. And one of the few, the reason modern Ohlone group consists only of 300 members lies only not in the early mission history. Gold was discovered here in 1848 when Mexico ceded this territory to the United States. And money flowed into San Francisco, and mansions that you're seeing right now are in Pacific Heights, and this was the area that hugely benefited from the gold rush. And the gold rush made San Francisco into largest metropolis west of Mississippi in the United States. But although Native Americans technically owned the mother lode, most of them, so mother lode is a gold-bearing belt in Sierra Nevada and other parts of California. Although they technically owned the mother lode, most of them saw nothing but the ruin. And gold extraction ruined the whole landscapes. Mercury poisoned farming grounds and hunting grounds. And the movement of settlers from the east itself brought European diseases. And what you're seeing right now came at the cost of indigenous population reduced by 4/5 in just the early days of the gold rush. Another long-term after effect of the gold rush, a big part of San Francisco mythology that we don't normally talk about, is mercury pollution of the San Francisco Bay. As far removed as we are from 1849, the way the gold was extracted, it amalgamates very well with mercury. And mercury was simply added into washing devices to make the extraction easier, meant that most of that traveled downstreams, and all the mercury mines have been closed for a good part of the century. The swimming in the bay, fishing in the bay, and consuming shellfish from it remains completely impossible, and it will probably remain so for another 150 years. And if you look at the San Francisco grid and compare it with Chicago, Minneapolis, or Phoenix, or even New York, you'll notice curves and bumps that defy normal urban planners' desire to get from point A to point B in the shortest possible manner. The part of the city where I currently live is hardly a grid at all. It looks like someone mischievous threw a ball of yarn onto the map. My part of San Francisco is a valley that is surrounded by hills and heights from 3 directions. And if I start walking from where I am, that's about where I am right now, I can reach Billy Goat Hill, Twin Peaks, Bernal Heights, Kite Hill, Tank Hill, College Hill, Mount Davidson, Buena Vista Heights, Corona Heights, and Diamond Heights, all within 40 minutes. I have climbed all the hills in my area and a great deal of hills in other ones. And even though I did that, every time I look at the view, I'm often not 100% sure what I'm seeing in front of me. So partial are the views and so convoluted the geography that it's sometimes very hard to figure out what's happening. And it's also the sheer number of hills. This is a view from nearby my area, so you can see how it undulates. So there's 42 hills in San Francisco. And all these hills calls for steps and stairs. And there are more than 600 of them in the city. And there's some that are worn and old. They're wide and stately ones, most of them, and around Nob Hill and Pacific Heights. There are ones that are overgrown with old plants and community gardens. And my favorites are Pemberton Steps on Twin Peaks. You're looking at them right now. And filbert steps in North Beach. And I mentioned the steps because I think they are a really important part of experiencing San Francisco and walking it. If you come here and you walk main thoroughfares and drags, I would argue most of what you would feel is a sense of mimicked history of something that tries to resemble the past but doesn't really have a foot in it. But if you walk filbert steps, it's very narrow, small steps in the most touristic part of the town, arguably. They're surrounded by the oldest buildings in the city, and they're also surrounded by beautiful garden that just lasts and lasts. There are southern magnolias and redwoods and fuchsias, date palms, and I think that's the way San Francisco is supposed to be experienced. And it's very easy to forget that, you know, when you actually reach the end of Filbert Steps, there's a bustling touristic waterfront, definitely one of the least pleasant parts of the city, Embarcadero, at least for me personally, Pier 39, and buffet of sterile looking 1990 office architecture. And one of my recent discoveries while walking the city was figuring out what the mysterious and ubiquitous brick circles placed on many city intersections. You will see what I'm talking about in a minute when I will cross the street while walking. So I wasn't sure what it was, and I set to research it. So in the spring of 1906, San Francisco all but burned to the ground because of the largest earthquake in its history. Fires raged for 3 days after it, so that's the circle. And you see quite a lot of them in the city, so if you're attentive, you would begin to wonder, what is this? So during the earthquake and its aftermath, 25,000 buildings were destroyed and 3,000 people died. And a great deal of those who died at that in those couple of days are buried under Alamo Square Park, one of the most beautiful in the city, beautiful places in the city, and it's also one of the unmarked graves that not everyone knows about. And in the aftermath, the city council tried to figure out how to prevent this from happening again. And the bricks that you have seen mark 175 underground cisterns that in total hold 11 million gallons of water that are placed in different spots in the city underground, and they can be accessed in case of a massive fire. So that's how the cistern map look like. And I really love walking over them and knowing there's this underground subterranean body of water underneath me. I will switch to the next part of my presentation, and I will also use this as an opportunity to see if there are any if there are any questions in the chat. Let me see, Q&A. No, we're good. Okay. Okay. I'll be on my way. Walking around San Francisco stimulates something in my brain that wants to learn the names of all the things I encounter. And being a non-native English speaker, I want to know, what is the name of this tree? How is this architectural detail called? What flower am I looking at? I spent a great deal of time walking around San Francisco and learning its plants. And standing on a street, staring at a tree, staring at your Western version of Audubon tree identification guide, it's a fantastic way to strike a conversation, even during a pandemic. the problem is that Audubon Identification Guide is really no help in San Francisco because it virtually has no native tree species. And if you look at the photographs of San Francisco as late as 1960s, the lack of trees in the streets is absolutely striking. And something happened in 1959, which might be one of the very few successful examples of cultural shaming in history. So Nikita Khrushchev, Soviet party leader, came to visit San Francisco, and he remarked, you know, you have a beautiful city, but what's up with the trees? Where are your trees? Are you too poor to plant them? And citywide tree planting program was opened exactly the same year. And the people all over the world came here to remake the city, and I would argue that's what makes its character so unique and so tolerant. In a similar way, the trees were brought here from as far as Brazil, China, New Zealand, Ireland, to make a city of sand dunes and concrete and strong coastal winds one of the most green places in the city. And in the early 1980s, the budget for tree planting program was cut, and so San Franciscans formed the Friends of Urban Forest. It's one of the oldest arborist organizations in the world, and at least in the New World. And it's absolutely stunning how many trees they plant weekly with residents and volunteers. And I want to show you a few wonderful trees from the collection, from the international collection that we enjoy here. Cypresses, California buckeye, it's the only native tree in the Bay Area. Palms, jacarandas, so South Africans and Sydneysiders recognize them. They're also transplants. Eucalyptus is the most ubiquitous tree in San Francisco, and 99% of eucalyptuses come from Australia. Another transplant from New Zealand, and that one is too. This palm has probably the best views on the city.
Oops, continue. Bougainvillea, not technically a tree, but still. And I want to end with ginkgo biloba to take us to the first historic district of interest, Chinatown. And San Francisco declared itself a sanctuary city in 1989. Technically, it means that the local government is trying to protect immigrants against federal immigration authorities, regardless of the legality of their status, and does not hold them for these immigration authorities unless they have felonies or on their record or their current charges pressed against them. However, the city wasn't always so welcoming to foreigners. So the first wave of Chinese immigration came here with the gold rush and continued with the building of the first transcontinental railroad. And at first, Chinese workers were, if not exactly welcome, they were tolerated. But as surface gold became scarce, the animosity towards them and other non-immigrants, especially the non-white ones, became violent. Chinese, as well as other minorities, were murdered, lynched. Their settlements along the building of the railroad were pogromed. So they began to settle in more cosmopolitan and safer places, San Francisco being one of them. Almost the entire Chinese population at the time was male, and prohibitions were put in place to prevent families to come with the workers. And to survive, this man took jobs that were not necessarily the most attractive to an average 19th century male. Laundries and restaurants. They also opened opium dens, brothels, CD drinking establishments, and gay bars, creating a long-lasting mythos of Chinatown as a place of vice and rowdy clientele and danger and tongs, Chinese gangs and brotherhoods fighting each other with hatchets and Shanghaiing naive drinkers. During the post-Civil War era economic decline, we're talking 1870s, Chinese men represented nearly a quarter of all wage-earning men in California. And the local population very quickly began to demonize Chinese immigrants in any role as invaders. And the issue got politicized, and in late 1800s, pretty horrific and first in the American history limitations on Chinese immigrations and behavior and even living conditions were put in place through first Chinese Exclusion Act and then Geary Act. I'm sure this rhetoric of invasion sounds very similar to it both in Europe and in the United States. And Donald Trump here have repeatedly used it in the last couple of years when he was describing migrant crisis on the southern border as the violent invasion. And I think it's interesting that gold rushes of various kinds, not this particular one that helped shape Mythos of San Francisco, they're very often presented as, festivals of equal opportunity and free market. But in reality, those mentions in the Pacific Heights that we saw a couple of slides earlier were built in part by work of these Chinese laborers. And today, California economy depends on agricultural workers coming from Central and South America through that southern border where, politicians talk about invasion. And arguably, California would not be able to survive without these workers, most of them illegal. I'm going to skip through a few slides and go to the next decade and the next neighborhood of importance. So in the late 1940s, San Francisco was still a conglomerate of little tribal villages. Castro and Noe Valley, where I live, were still working class Irish Italian neighborhoods, although Mission Irish were already beginning to give way to immigrants from South and Central America. Fillmore had still the reputation of Harlem of the West. It was a really uptight, conservative, Italian-Irish Catholic city. When Lawrence Ferlinghetti came here, he was an aspiring poet and painter in 1951. And in a couple of years, he opened City Lights, which became US first all-paper bookstore. And at the time, the neighborhood began slowly changing. So it was a place of popping up jazz joints, underground gay bars, and cafes, strip bars that welcome disembarking sailors, and cafes that would eventually welcome beat writers and poets. So what we're looking right now is Lombard Street, the most winding street in the city, and it's on Telegraph Hill, which is just a few steps away from Café Trieste, a major beach haunt that we'll look just a moment ago, and from there we'll go to look at the Columbus Avenue. So we're on Columbus Avenue right near the City Lights at this moment. So back to the beats. The core group of beats, Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Neal Cassady, and William Burroughs, met at Columbia in New York. They added a few core members here, Ferlinghetti, one of them. He actually turned 100 years this year. And poet Gary Snyder. And they made San Francisco into their hub. And even before Beats came here, North Beach was an interesting place. Traditional conservative Italian ways here somehow coexisted with all the pleasures for disembarking sailors and other adventurers. Dock workers came here to drink, but also to forge early labor movement in San Francisco. So it's not entirely surprising that Beats, with their rejection of linear narrative and sexual freedom and interest in exploring mystical Christian tradition and at the same time Eastern religions, found a spot here. And we're looking at Vesuvius, which was Kerouac's and Cassidy's favorite haunt, and it still has some of that, at least during the day. It still has a very non-touristic feel. And so I would argue that Beats made a really lasting imprint on the city, even if you'd never read their poems or novels, or you never drank at Vesuvius during the day, or you're never Jack Kerouac Alley, that's what we're looking right now. I never tried to fit into the smallest bathroom on the West Coast that has probably more lead paint that it's been legal in California for half a century in Cafe Trieste. So I think this imprint lasts, or it lasted 50 years later and 6,000 miles earlier when I was hitchhiking through Ukraine with Jack Kerouac's On the Road in my backpack. And you can no longer buy an anarchist Italian newspaper at City Lights, but it remains one of the best bookshops in the country. Its whole second floor is devoted to poetry. It still hosts incredible poetry and underground literature events. And it feels wonderfully and authentically old in a place that mimics the past but has no foot in it. And so before I take us to the next spot, I want to show you photographs of older beats by Ira Novinsky. It was very strange to see them mature. So it's Robert Duncan, William Burroughs, Ginsberg. A wedding at Cafe Trieste, and a party at City Lights bookstore. Okay, and I'll switch us to the next part of the presentation. We're about to get to Haight-Ashbury. So while it loads, I'll speak a little bit about the Haight. So by the early 1960s, North Beach became a tourist haunt rather than beatnik haunts. And it was neighborhood across the town, Haight-Ashbury, that became a spot for people who were tuning in, turning on, and dropping out en masse. And it was a very strange moment in American history. 1950s American dream really disintegrated. A war in Vietnam was raging. And depending on whom you ask, it was the worst of times, it was the best of times. And one thing that everyone seemed to agree upon was that time seemed to speed up. We're now walking through Haight Street. And I just want to quickly take you through the timeline while we walk the Haight. So in 1962, Rachel Carson publishes Silent Spring, which exposes the repercussions of massive use of pesticides. It's really the first time in American history where a lot of people realize the cost of progress. 1963, early integration campaign happens in Birmingham. Martin Luther King makes I Have a Dream speech in Washington. And it's the same year when JF Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas. Then 1964, next year, anti-war protests engulf most campuses in the country. So imagine what was happening here with George Floyd protests just a couple of weeks ago and still continue, but happening literally in every campus. 1965, Watts riots break out in LA after the episode of police brutality against an African-American man. 1967, it's the same year when the Summer of Love happens in San Francisco, and the deadliest and most violent riots in the history of the United States happen in Detroit, again in retaliation for police brutality against the Black community. And I could probably talk about contradictory, fragmentary, apathetic, self-indulgent, revolutionary hippie movement that made San Francisco its home for a whole hour. And you can look at 1960s and say, well, this was a lost opportunity for working class and liberal causes to make lasting progress. It was also a time when conservative forces regrouped and made a lot of silent advances in policing, in prison complex, in public policy that haunt us to this day. But we also embrace diversity in a lot of ways. More of what was revolution became, more of what was becoming revolution back then became a new norm. You know, communes mostly failed, but organic farming, co-ops, food, attention to food as politics and as pleasure and as health, that persisted. Healthcare was democratized, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later. And queer people made advances in the legal standing and cultural acceptance that, you know, this is something that has never happened before anywhere else. And San Francisco was also at the center of the music revolution. There was a moment when Grateful Dead, Santana, Jimi Hendrix, Jefferson Airplane, and Janis Joplin all lived within a mile of, in this area, in the Haight. And their music was a big part of what actually brought Summer of Love here and not somewhere else, because a great deal of people came here to listen to them. And I want to mention one seed that was quietly planted in Haight-Ashbury in the 60s. So young kids who were flowing here in 1967 weren't exactly welcomed with open arms by everyone. And local authorities thought that if they opened a clinic in the area, that will actually encourage them to stay. And David Smith was a recent college graduate from UCSF. He decided to change the situation. And he, in a meeting with public health officials of the city, he said something that would become a slogan of free clinic movement. He said, healthcare is a right, not a privilege. You know, something that started as a small clinic that treated cold, miserable kids on bad LSD trips in 1967 became a huge movement that is 1,200 clinics strong right now. And I believe that it will eventually sway a mass of current healthcare politics in the United States and, you know, would sway to socialized insurance. And I want to briefly show you the spot where the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic was. It now has a much bigger location a little bit further away. I was initially worried to film there because I thought these people were queuing into the clinic and I didn't want to offend their privacy, but then I realized they were queuing to the post office. Okay, and now I'm going to take us across the town to a place where people normally don't go when they visit San Francisco as tourists or when visiting their friends. I want to take you to Hunter's Point, and I want to do it to acknowledge the divide that often exists between the white American history and the history of its people of color and its native indigenous groups. So while psychedelic parties and kids with flour in their hair having fun in Haight-Ashbury, a parallel history plays out in Hunter's Point. And let's jump 3 decades back in history for some context. So on the eve of the World War II, the Navy seized shipyards in San Francisco and the area. You actually see that area right now. So we're overlooking the former shipyard area from the ridge. And they began manufacturing ships for the Pacific Amphitheater of War and ammunition. And they also began recruiting workers to do that. And a great deal of those workers were African Americans coming from Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Texas. They were escaping very restrictive Jim Crow South, and the Navy also paid pretty good. So in the first 3 years of war, 100,000 people migrated to San Francisco, most of them Black. And so before the war, there were virtually no Black people in the city. Its San Francisco population was 95% white. And population of the Hunters Point, the area where we are now, was 14,000 people, 7 of whom were Black. And in 1940, the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard was employing 6,000 people. Almost every one of them were Black. And so these people had to find housing when they came here. And some of them settled in Western Addition, a traditionally Black area in the middle of the city. But most of them, including in Hunters Point, came across hostility and lack of desire of white landlords to rent to Blacks. So Navy seized the Hunters Point Ridge, the area we're driving through now, and they threw up 4,000 family housing units and 8,000 single dormitories. The war ended and Blacks were dismissed or replaced by whites in very few remaining shipyards job. And the area and its residents fell in really hard times. It was a food desert with disintegrating temporary housing that was never supposed to stand there for 30 and more years. No good public schools, no public amenities, no public transportation links to the rest of the city, and no way out, no social elevators that we tend to take for granted. And shipyards also have left a hugely polluted bay. In San Francisco Bay and the shipyards area remains a Superfund site, meaning that there are special cleanup operations happening until this day, and they're managed by Army Corps of Engineers. And walking through this area, it's still extremely common to see people in hazmat suits replacing the soil and see the notices like, don't disturb the ground. And almost every cultural wave creates some level of displacement of what has been here before. And pre-war Hunters Point had virtually no African Americans. And while for now it remains a predominantly Black area, the process of pushing out its residents has already begun. And you can see from the views and from how the area looks like that there would be a desire to make this area into new Pacific Heights. And as one of the San Francisco urban planners famously said in the 80s, this area is too valuable to let poor people park their cars on it. He said that about South of Market area. And I'm worried, and I really hope the community could step up and prevent this same history from happening here. And I'm going to take you from the Hunters Point Ridge. This is the area actually where Last Black Man in San Francisco was filmed, and I would really recommend the film. So I want to take you to the next neighborhood of importance. My apologies, I want to make sure that you don't see the gallery, and it's not in the way. So the next important set of events in San Francisco history happens in Castro. We're walking through Castro Street right now, and it's really uplifting for me. I live nearby to see this area opening up. Normally it's very, very joyful part of town, and in part because and in part despite of its history. So it was an epicenter for a fight for gay rights in the late 70s. And then it also became a hotspot for AIDS epidemics in the early 80s and up until the mid 90s. Some of the San Francisco openness that I so admire comes from its roots as the frontier town. So early settlers and fortune seekers who came here came from the variety of cultures, and 95% of them were men. And they were thrust into this anarchic environment of the frontier, and they were just less likely to abide by any rules and conventions that would otherwise happen in their hometowns. But that relative permissiveness, it really didn't last long. And the city has never been committed to LGBTQ rights. Actually, in 1863, there were cross-dressing laws introduced to actually prevent people from cross-dressing. And this ridiculous law remained in place until 1974, and a month before it was repealed, 10 men were arrested in Tenderloin for wearing women's clothing. And so in the 1960s, police raids on gay bars and prominent persecution cases, and arguably the legacy of Stonewall riots in New York in 1969, began to politicize the movement. And it was the first time when people began to demand concrete rights and protections. Before I go further, we will soon see the House and the party, I'm not sure, election hub of Harvey Milk, prominent San Francisco gay rights activist. So sometimes the battle between progressive and conservative causes in America is very unlike San Francisco landscape. You know, in 1972, when the first gay parade is held in Castro, Anita Bryant starts an anti-gay right campaign. She was a singer and a model turned anti-gay right activist. The campaign was called Save Our Children, and its goal was to be able to fire and refuse or expel from the housing any person based on their sexual orientation. Then in 1977, Harvey Milk was elected as the first gay official in San Francisco. And the same year, he introduces the very first gay rights ordinance in the country. And the same exact year, he had to fight Briggs Initiative, which was put on a ballot. And again, its goal was to be able to fire any teacher in California who was either gay or sympathetic to gay rights. And the proposition lost spectacularly. But Milk and Mayor Moscone were murdered by a former policeman and conservative former supervisor Dan White the next year. Then in 1981, HIV virus gets discovered. But surviving Castro community members estimate that likely in 1979, the virus was already present in the community and at least 10% of people were infected. By 1981, when the test became available, the numbers were likely close to 50%. And at the time, Ronald Reagan was the president, and for the longest time, he refused to acknowledge that the pandemic was happening and to channel federal funds in fighting it. And there were weeks when, because of so little was known about the disease, hospital staff would just refuse to treat people with AIDS because they were afraid to catch it. The atmosphere was very close to hysteria, though twice there was a proposition put on a ballot in the city of San Francisco to try and forcibly test people working in healthcare and service and forcibly quarantine people with HIV. And before the invention of antiretroviral drugs in 1995, over 15,000 San Franciscans died of AIDS. There were weeks when Bay Area Reporter ran just pages and pages of obituaries, and that is like a compound page from one of the issues when the whole weekly issue consisted of photographs of people who died of AIDS. And in comparison, during the global pandemic right now, which has a very different nature, but under 6,000 people ever got infected in San Francisco. And for now, there were only 56 deaths since early March when the statistics began. And then in 1983, volunteers in San Francisco General Hospital stepped up and created Ward 5B. And this ward, staffed by volunteers, created a San Francisco model of care, which was something that never happened before anywhere else. It was, this model of care for AIDS patients was way more participatory, way more caring, and at all not authoritarian at all. And it might sound weird right now, but maybe if you watched Agnes Varda Cleo from 9 to 5, the whole film is centered around her waiting for the results of her biopsy. She's worried she has cancer. And so at the end, her doctor tells her, your biopsy is fine. You'll be okay. You just need to come to the hospital for 5 months. And that's how interactions with doctors look like before feminists and AIDS rights activists took on medical establishments in the 70s. So in most cases, you didn't even have a right to know your prognosis and even your diagnosis. And I'm going to take us to current moment we're in. So we're in permanent boomtown. And we're in the area that used to be an industrial, light industrial / residential areas in the 80s, south of Market. And you can see now it's parks and museums and office buildings. And so even with the inevitable Disneyification, you can still feel the reverberations of ideas that made North Beach and Haight-Ashbury and Castro history. Something important happened there, and even when that wave rolled back, it left a trace that persists despite the knick-knack shops and expensive restaurants and tourist traps of various kinds. The question is whether the current cultural wave will be the last when San Francisco is able to keep that openness. The city stands on San Andreas Fault, and it's been pretty much razed to the ground in the last big earthquake in 1906. It had survived 7 major fires, and it's still susceptible to fires with all its beautiful wooden Edwardians and Victorians. But its future is more threatened by its success rather than by any natural disaster. And I think a month ago, I picked up a book titled Painted Ladies about San Francisco Victorians, published in 1978. I wanted to inundate this talk with my knowledge of Italianate and George Eastlake style buildings. And its authors aptly predicted that they would be the next to last generation to be afford a house of one's own in San Francisco. And it proved to be true. 1 bedroom rent, monthly rent in the city is $3,500. It's the highest in the country. The smallest, shabbiest house that you can find within city limits costs around $2 million. At the same time, minimum wage in San Francisco brings $33,000 annually. There are over 10,000 homeless people in San Francisco, and probably more since it's an official count. The average salary in the city is $74,000, but mid-range positions in tech industry often pay $250,000 annually and more. So how did this disparity came come into being. Silicon Valley tech boom has skyrocketed the cost of living and created massive displacement of what was here before. There were over 16,000 evictions in the city just in the past 15 years to make room for newcomers who are able to pay fair market price. Another thing that contributes to the situation is the incomes of middle class in the United States and actually everywhere else have been stagnant since 1980s, adjusted for inflation that virtually have not changed. And at the same time, the incomes of the top 10% have raised dramatically. So what it creates is a not trickle-down effect in wealth. It creates a trickle-down effect in the prices of major purchases, and particularly in housing and education. So it's not just poets and artists that are losing the opportunity to survive in the city. It's also people who perform essential services for modest compensation, you know, from teachers to firefighters to waiters. And culturally, I would argue that unbridled capitalism is turning a city of hills and valleys into a flat parking lot. And as a society, we've been avoiding a question of what is the acceptable level of income inequality? What is the acceptable level of difference between high earners and people who serve food, people who clean hospital rooms, who police us, who teach kids? And if the city can only house the rich, how will it work? How will the future look like? So ideologically, San Francisco is one of the most liberal places in the country. It's also one of the most diversity-friendly ones. But in practice, it's getting extremely hard to come here to rebuild one's life, to reinvent yourself, something that it offered all the way throughout its history, and learn how to coexist with other eccentrics peacefully. Something that's so unique about the city for me personally. And the limited size of San Francisco, you know, it has no space to grow, it has no space to sprawl, contributes to this issue. And money has a huge homogenizing effect, and while Silicon Valley is no dark satanic mill, it doesn't dump mercury or nuclear waste into San Francisco Bay. The question remains whether its legacy would prove as toxic as the legacy of the shipyards and gold rush. I love the city dearly, and I hope that I was able to take you on an interesting journey through its streets and a little bit through its history. And I really hope that through walking and better understanding our cities, we will come up with ways to keep them open for workers and artists and writers and eccentrics of every imaginable kind. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. That was great. An amazing insight into the city. I just wanted to maybe, oh, sorry. Hello.
No worries. I just realized that I want to make sure I do this. It's like a formal moment, but I want to do a few acknowledgements for image credit. And if someone decides to read more about San Francisco, this is an amazing list to start with. And yep, thank you. Now I'm definitely done.
Thank you. I'm sure we've got lots of questions. I was just going to kick off with something though that I put in the chat box, and it was just basically as you, towards the end of the walk, you were talking about this kind of weird paradox of, you know, the foundations of a city being based on its sort of liberal identity, and the poets and the artists that have given it its sort of character. then themselves being kind of pushed out. And this kind of process of sort of gentrification, I suppose, is very common. In other cities, and I was kind of reminded of, the story of Soho in New York, or East End in London, or whatever. What do you think makes San Francisco different to that kind of broader or general kind of move? What's sometimes described as the sort of stormtroopers moving in and then being kind of pushed out to other areas.
In San Francisco, some people call it frontierism. The same attitude of frontier, when people who don't have many attachments come and do things without much thought for the future repercussions, and money move easily and people are ground underfoot equally easily. I am not sure. I think San Francisco is in a unique position because there's no other place in the world where capital and technology is so highly concentrated in that Silicon Valley. And on the other hand, the liberal forces are concentrated, maybe if not here, but in Berkeley, in a very, very strong manner. And my feelings are that we can come up, if anywhere, we can come up with a solution that would be, not putting a Band-Aid on a sinking ship, but doing something way more radical. Actually asking that question: what is fair? What kind of income is fair? And these questions have been asked before in the United States history. Estate tax, I don't want to take us too deeply into my politics, but estate tax in the United States during Eisenhower era, Republican president, was 99% after certain levels. And it was completely acceptable at the time. So I think what's unique about San Francisco and the surrounding area is that I see the opportunity to ask these questions here and to again be a concentration or a forebearer of something new that doesn't end with just parking lot of people who dress the same, have the same level of education, prefer the same types of food and the same types of interior design in their coffee shops, as it's been slowly getting there.
Ania, I have a question, but maybe just before that, looking at the chat box, you can see an appreciation. Carlos saying incredible, thank you. And from Brad, what you had to say about the low biodiversity in flora. And a recommendation from Katharina about Rebecca Solnit's Infinite City. I actually wrote down as I was listening, I just, I was thinking this is such a compelling narrative and so informed by literary and filmic and, and socio-historical reference. And you're just struck by, you're bringing in of a tale of two cities. It was the best of times and the worst of times. So, I'm sort of, it's making me think about those sort of disparities. But on two occasions, you used this phrase of to do with mimicking the past, but not having a foot in it. I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about that.
I think a lot of cities are at risk of becoming museums of their own past. And it's very easy to hold on to some image of idealized something. And so this idealized version of Gold Rush is still played out in Disneyland in Orange County, in tourist-dependent towns across the old 49 route in America. And I think and of course, buses of tourists came to North Beach by the late 1950s to look at beats and beatniks. So it's not a contemporary, exclusively contemporary thing. I think there are two dangers of holding on to that and focusing on that as the core of the city. And so one of them is that mimicking the past always involves a level of simplification. You know, telling people the story of a gold rush where Latinos are lynched and Chinese people are pogromed and whole landscapes are turned into mud and Native Americans are scalped and $20 are paid for each ear someone can bring into the city council. It's not an extremely attractive history to tell someone who's just came here and wanted to have a beer. And I don't necessarily think we have to make all entertainment an educational and prudish story of all the mistakes we have made throughout the history. But I think areas like North Beach, areas like Haight, which I love 60s, and the Haight has so little to do with it right now. It's it's a concentration of expensive shoe shops. They're just, you can still feel it there, but you have to go to feel it. You have to go look at the Grateful Dead house. You have to go to Zoom Zoom, which is one of the few remaining bars. I think when capital gets concentrated in the hands of people who don't have enough time or desire to engage with the past in a more informed manner and come up with a future that also doesn't copy what's next to you, but tries to do something anew, but growing on, and I feel like we live on a dead body of culture, and the goal of living for me is just to try and build something, try and resurrect some of that, but also build something anew. So I think the ability of people who feel these intricacies to open a place in San Francisco, to afford a rent here for a shop or for a poetry space or for an artist space is crucial to keep that alive. If everyone who owns a bar in North Beach just made their money in tech, it's not going to happen. And I think people who come here as tourists understand that. That's why there are no other bookshops in North Beach. There's just city lights.
Well, in connection to that, I think Jaspar, you had a comment about a lot of boarded up shops. Was it in North Beach? Was that your?
That may have been to do with lockdown. I don't know, but it was really interesting just walking up the road through your view and just catching that moment of what seemed like I don't know, an in-between stage of kind of reopening, people sort of emerging and sort of the signs in the windows saying welcome back. There was something in the bookshop that said welcome back, as if
we're open. Yeah. People actually raised, so city lights struggle to remain afloat, and city residents raised $500,000 in 5 days for it to remain open. I really wanted to walk us through Fillmore, but unfortunately there was not enough time. And part of Fillmore is this is a former it's like an important Black history area, important jazz area in San Francisco, and part of it is extremely expensive right now. And this is the area where I encountered the largest amount of boarded up shops. And some of this related to, concerns about violence during the protests. But most of it is really an inability to pay rent. The commercial rent for a small shop in Fillmore is close to $20,000 per month. And this again, it plugs into this concerns. Landlords say, okay, your shop is not working, you have to move out, and they hope that someone else will come over and take over this space when this ends or soon enough to make money. But the reality is, if you can't afford to risk, and with a $20,000 lease per month, you can't afford to risk, the way that places reopen becomes very homogeneous. So places that reopen are very similar to themselves. And what's so delightful about the cities is that they were, in the past at least, were able to support all sorts of small eccentric places. And that's why people came to the cities, because in the suburb, businesses had to cater to the majority. But in the city, you could find, a group of a small tribe that would have its own comic book shop, or something that was very specific and peculiar, much less so. And so I think when I walk these boarded up shops, a constant reminder of this reduced multiplicity and reduced diversity.
Dolly, is this this presentation, is it a writing in progress? Is this something that you're working on as text?
I think there's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
You meant Ania, right? I think you said Dolly.
Did I say Dolly? Oh, forgive me.
No worries.
Where was my head at? Sorry, Ania, sorry.
No, I think San Francisco already has its unofficial historian, Rebecca Solnit, and I would recommend to everyone, I would recommend her books to everyone. She's absolutely fantastic, and if you have an opportunity to hear her speak, she's just incredible. And I'm not a writer. I'm a visual artist. So I'm now, as Dolly mentioned, I'm working on a piece of docufiction that, hopefully will help imagine that future that I was talking about. And all those historic connections, I probably left out, so much trivia to stop inundating you and actually try and give people who tuned in an experience of the city rather than a Wikipedia, an in-depth Wikipedia page. But that helped me to leave some parts that are poetic or just don't fit this talk. And I'm also working on a short film about, I wouldn't call it about the city, maybe about my personal experience of the city that will hopefully resonate with other people.
Well, thank you for your coolness under fire when we lost the connection, and thank you everyone that came back to us. Jaspar, is there anything you want to sort of follow up?
No, I mean, I feel that you've given us lots to digest, an incredible amount to reflect on and think about, these cultural waves. You talk about the various areas of San Francisco that are new to me, really fascinating, and incredibly generous the way that you've thought so carefully about the footage as well and presented it through these different areas of the city as drive-throughs sometimes, but also walk-throughs that tell us quite different things about those locations or areas and perspectives. So I just really want to say thank you, and I'm sure many of us will be thinking about your walk for some time. Dolly, maybe it would make sense to kind of finish with you. We probably should wrap up quite soon. Do you want to kind of say the final words, or do you have anything you want to finish with?
I'd like to agree with everybody and say thank you so much, Ania. I knew you'd be amazing. Your research is impeccable, and I'd also like to add that the reason why at the start I mentioned that it's interesting that you are a narrator in your art, and I don't know, I just really enjoyed listening to literally walking us and talking us through. So thank you. Please, everybody, check out Ania's website, and I can't wait to see there's two new pieces that will be released over the next year, I believe. But there's the new one Westward Ho, which is up now. So you have a look. Was it Westward Ho or Westward Low? Sorry, I just...
Westward Ho. And it's, you know, it's in part related to San Francisco because Westward Ho is about manifest destiny and moving, pushing the civilization back to, no, sorry, not back, but to the West Coast.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to everyone for tuning in, and to the Walkative Society for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Enjoy the rest of your day.